Good evening, everyone. Schools have become a battleground for today's culture wars, and our kids are being affected. We are thankful you're taking the time to join us for our conversation about sending kids back to school during these culture wars. We have a resource guide available for you with some key notes from this webinar and additional links for you to explore. This is located on our webinar page at fmsfound.org. This was presented live on August 22nd, 2022, and we are re-recording this presentation just a couple of weeks later to improve the audio quality for you. I'm Carrie McMillan. I have a Master's of Science in Education and School Counseling, and I worked in a public school in the Rochester area for several years, seeing a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about firsthand. And this is my colleague, Bridget Heap, who has a Master's in Philosophical Apologetics. She co-authored The Sexual Holocaust, A Global Crisis, and is a wonderful homeschool mom. We are both research associates with Feed My Sheep Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on promoting a biblical worldview. As a part of the Center for Childhood Innocence, we're presenting this webinar and hope you leave feeling informed and encouraged to take next steps to protect kids.
Thank you, Carrie. So it is the time of year when our children are getting ready to go back to school. And when our kids walk through those school doors, they will be walking into a cultural war zone. Schools used to be a place of education, but today they are also a breeding ground of activism and woke indoctrination. Activists are rapidly teaching our children new definitions of words and concepts, which make their ideologies appear acceptable and even loving. Schools are now being used as a mechanism to reduce parental rights, and government funded schools are replacing parental authority for teaching values. Now, there are three main concerning cultural ideologies being promoted through our schools right now. The first is a gender ideology that trains children to question their gender and accept subjective truths. The second is an ideology of sexuality that sexualizes our children and normalizes all forms of sexual behaviors. The third is a race ideology, which teaches children that the color of their skin determines their role as oppressed or oppressor. Now, today, in the interest of time, we are going to provide an overview for just these first two ideologies: the normalization of gender confusion and the sexualization of our children.
And these cultural ideologies are confusing our children. A recent poll done by the Barna Group shows that many of our children in Generation Z, ages 10 to 25, are unable to explain why they hold the positions they do regarding most cultural issues. Barna researchers heard time and time again from teens, "I don't know, I'm so confused," when they were asked basic questions about their beliefs. We believe it is a parent's job to help their children navigate these cultural issues, and certainly grandparents, youth leaders, aunts, uncles, family, friends, we all play a role in helping kids navigate these things as well. And honestly, many of us don't even understand these issues ourselves or know where to start and how to talk to kids about them. So as a result, we've put together these two talks. In part one, we're going to look at the overarching issues of changing the meaning of love and truth, and then go into the two cultural issues with several examples of what our kids are being taught: gender confusion and the sexualization of children. Then in part two, which has already been recorded, we invited Dr. Erin Brewer to join us. She is co-founder of Advocates Protecting Children and author of Parenting in a Transgender World. And she discussed how to talk to our kids, how to parent in today's world, and really how to prepare kids to face these issues. We also identified some very specific steps that parents can take to protect their kids as they head back to school.
Right. So before we jump into talking about the gender and sexuality issues our children are being taught, we first want to look at how activists have twisted our definitions of love and truth to make their ideologies appear to be the truth and appear to be the loving perspective. Now, one reason that people, including our children, are buying into these narratives is because they are convinced that these ideologies are true and the only way to be loving to people. So, understanding the difference between the cultural perspective and the Christian perspective on these issues can help us to accurately discern which positions are really true and loving. Now, we understand that not everyone watching is a Christian, but certainly people with other faiths and even those that just have a more traditional view can relate to what we're saying. Now, we've created a simple chart that compares the cultural definition of truth and love with the Christian definition of truth and love. So let's start with truth. So, the cultural narrative says that truth is subjective, meaning that truth is determined by the individual, whereas the Christian worldview says that truth is objective, meaning that truth is determined by God.
So, why is the concept of truth so important for this conversation about cultural issues? The Barna Group concluded from their study that for many teens, truth seems relative at best and at worst, altogether unknowable. They said there's a growing sense among Gen Z that what's true for someone else may not be true for me. And so you've probably heard this line of thinking without realizing it. You may have heard some people say, speak your truth, or your truth and my truth may not be the same.
Right. So the cultural narrative says that the individual decides what's true for them, but cannot determine what is true for everyone else. And our children are buying into this cultural narrative and believe that each person makes up what is true for himself or herself. So, is it possible that this narrative could be true? Well, no, because it is self contradictory. So, in order for this to be true, you would have to push that belief on everyone, even though that belief says you can't do that. Now, let's look at a real life example of this. Let's pretend that you get pulled over for driving 75 in a 55-mile-per-hour zone. The police officer who believes in objective truth will state that the speed limit in that zone is 55, and therefore you're speeding. However, if you believe in let's say that you believe in subjective truths. Therefore, you argue with the police officer that for you, the speed limit is 75 miles per hour in that zone. So, if truth really was subjective, then the police officer would have to accept your truth that the speed limit for you is 75 miles an hour in that zone. So therefore, you would be pushing your belief on him, and he doesn't get to believe the reality of objective truths in this example. And this is essentially what's happening today. And in this presentation, we will talk about how embracing subjective truths affects our view of gender and sexuality. Now, I hope you were able to follow me through this, and I hope you can see how the current cultural narrative about truth is a self-defeating or contradictory belief. Now, I understand that this is a difficult and abstract concept to wrestle with, which is why I strongly recommend Nancy Pearcey's book, Finding Truth. Her book can give you tools to better analyze the cultural issues that our children are wrestling with, and we have listed this book on our resource guide for you. Now, before we move on, I do just want to point out that the Christian perspective that God creates absolute and universal truths is not a contradictory belief. Okay, so that was just a brief look at why truth is important for our conversation tonight. And now let's go ahead and let's look at love. So, the cultural worldview says that love affirms all subjective truths, whereas the Christian worldview said that love does not delight in evil.
And our children want to be kind and love the people around them. And they're also growing up in a post Christian culture with a very different framework of what is normalized. So, as you can see on the left chart, the top green line shows that in 2021, over 20% of adults in Generation Z, so those born between 97 and 2012, identified as LGBTQ. That is more than 1 in every 5 people. In the chart on the right, you can see that over 5% of adults aged 18 to 29 identify as transgender or non binary, with most of that number identifying as non binary. So if you aren't familiar, non-binary means that these individuals believe their gender is not represented in maleness or femaleness, but is outside of the gender binary of male or female. So these individuals are our kids' friends, teachers, and other young adults that they look up to. And naturally, they're concerned about loving their friends. So when they're taught that to be loving, you need to affirm all subjective truths, then this seems to them like the only option. And the message about affirming is certainly hidden in a lot of messages that we see in our culture. So you may have seen some of these signs or slogans. Love is love. Certainly, you've heard that. This one shows hope, love, equality, inclusion, kindness, with peace running down it in the pride rainbow. And then in this household, Black Lives Matter, no human being is illegal, love is love, science is real, women's rights are human rights, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, kindness is everything, the time is always right to do what is right.
So, our culture has confused the meaning of being loving. Now, the cultural narrative says that in order to be loving, you must accept and affirm all perspectives. The problem with this is that not all perspectives are true or helpful or good. In fact, many of the lies that we're hearing today are quite harmful. And I would even go so far as to say that they are evil. Now, it's easy to see that we live in a broken world, right? Things don't function the way that they should. Even we as humans don't. We say or do things that we know are wrong and shouldn't do. So, what we mean by evil is normalizing, celebrating, embracing, and perpetuating this brokenness of humanity rather than looking to God for what is good. Now, as parents, we need to help our children see that people can be loving even when we disagree with someone's perspective. So, the Christian perspective of being loving is treating all people as being created in God's image. We should represent the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13 by being patient and kind and not self seeking and so forth. We can and should take a person's perspective seriously, but if that perspective is flawed, meaning that it's not true, and if it causes harm, meaning that it's not loving, then we do not have to accept those positions or celebrate them. As a matter of fact, it would be unloving to do so.
Okay, so in summary of this last section, the idea of something being true is being twisted to be subjective, so that whatever someone says is true must be true. If you are a woman, then the culture says you must be a woman because you say so, even if biologically, maybe you're a man. And the idea of being loving is being twisted to mean that we just have to accept what other people say to be true. So culturally, kids are taught that it's loving to agree with the person that, yes, they are a woman, even if they are not in reality a woman. So that brings us to the first of two cultural issues that we're digging into tonight: the normalization of gender confusion. These days, if you don't accept the idea that gender is a spectrum and something that is different from biological sex, then you may be labeled a hater or a transphobe. But we will take a look at this a little closer and identify, is this ideology actually true and loving? So there's no question that this false gender ideology has completely infiltrated our schools. I've seen it firsthand, and I've also been made aware of countless examples from other districts as well. One way or another, children are bombarded with messaging about this new gender ideology. And we're just going to flip through some of the ways that they're seeing this. So this first example is to show that the kids' school environment is being painted over in this gender ideology. In the school classrooms and halls, you see LGBTQ pride flags, trans flags, posters announcing pride celebration days throughout the year, and of course, instructional and interactive bulletin boards for kids to learn about definitions. So you can see on this one, there's definitions of love, gender identity, gender fluidity, agender, polyamorous relationships, and so forth.
So, our second example is the GSA clubs. Now, these are after school clubs which promote and celebrate the LGBTQ plus agenda. And children are encouraged to join these clubs through fun activities, but they don't realize that through these clubs, they are being indoctrinated to accept this gender ideology. Now, even if your children do not participate in these clubs, they will be exposed to this gender ideology through posters and events created or hosted by these clubs.
And lesson plans are embedded throughout the grade levels on this topic. So, this example is about understanding pronouns for second through fifth graders. And it reads the book They, She, He, Me, Free to Be, which instructs kids to explore their pronouns and even make some up for themselves.
The gender unicorn is another example of a lesson plan teaching this gender ideology. And this lesson teaches a child that gender identity and gender expression are a spectrum and that it is important to decide where he or she falls on those spectrums.
Educational videos are used in the classroom, and this one for children is all about pronouns and gender identity. It introduces a variety of new pronouns, such as the ones on the screen, and then states it is important to ask for and use the pronouns requested, which is a basic sign of respect for a person's humanity and identity. You can just see how coercive it is for kids when they're taught that this isn't just something some people believe, but instead that fully embracing this new ideology is the only way to respect a person's humanity.
Children are being exposed to this gender ideology through the books that they can access in the classroom and their libraries. So, this book called Being You teaches very young children that some babies grow into a different gender than the one that grown-ups called them. And this can be a very frightening thought for young children and can start to cause confusion and anxiety about figuring out who they really are.
And another way this enters the schools is through presentations from activist organizations, including taxpayer funded drag queen story hours. So they read books, often on gender and sexuality, with a purpose to expose and normalize these behaviors. So the California Healthy Youth Act framework for kindergarten through third grade actually specifically tells teachers they should be sure to include transgender guest speakers for the purpose of defying stereotypes and being role models.
So, this gender ideology is now being included in all curriculums as a basic truth. So, here is one example from a math curriculum called Prodigy. A class has 30 students. There are 10 students that identify as non binary. What is the ratio of non binary students to other genders? So, the point here with this example is that children are not just being exposed to this through health classes, it's actually being normalized in every subject area a child studies.
And another way this is entering schools is through activist teachers who believe it's their responsibility to spread acceptance of this agenda. So we have a video on our YouTube channel, which is linked on the parent resource guide, which has several examples of teachers coming out to their students and incorporating their gender ideology into the classroom. So one example has a teacher who uses a class puppet that's non-binary to teach the class about non-binary identities and how to use they, them pronouns.
Now, as we continue with a few more examples, we want to help encourage you to think deeper about why these methods are being used to indoctrinate children with this gender ideology. So, this next example is from the National Sex Ed Standards. And in New York, we do have bills that were in committee this past year that would adopt these standards for all New York public and charter schools. And here you could see that for third through fifth graders, children are expected to learn about the role of hormone blockers. So, our question is, why are children being taught about puberty blocking drugs and cross sex hormones as young as 8 years old?
This book, I Am Jazz, and is included in many gender-focused lesson plans. It states, I have a girl brain, but a boy body. This is called transgender. I was born this way. So, the question I want to ask here is, why do many school systems and teachers feel justified in training children in a mystic belief system that kids can somehow be born into the wrong body and must be concerned with figuring out their true gender identity? And these are some examples of gender support plans. So, with the increasing number of kids identifying as trans or gender nonconforming, some schools are starting to be organized with how they document these gender changes. And if you notice, the one on the left at the bottom where it's highlighted asks, is this parent or guardian aware of the name the student will use and the pronouns the student will use? Should this parent or guardian be informed as part of this process? And then the one on the left, or sorry, the right, is filled out. And at the top, it says, are guardians and any family aware? So notice here, they even removed the language of parents altogether, which is becoming quite popular. So this is filled out indicating no, the guardians are not aware and there's no solid plan to tell them at this time. So that in conjunction with this example, which is a gender closet where kids can leave their house wearing an outfit their parents approve of, and then change their clothes at school and then change again before they go home. So the idea is that they can dress like whatever gender they want at school without their parents knowing. So the question for this and the previous slide is, why do schools feel it's their place to purposefully hide a child's transgender identity from their parents and even directly deceive the parents about their child's identity?
Okay, so now that we have reviewed some examples of how children as young as 5 or 6 are being introduced to this gender confusion in schools, we're actually going to outline the differences between what the culture is teaching about gender and the traditional or Christian view of gender. And just remember that this chart is in the parent resource guide for you. So, first of all, the cultural narrative says that gender is fluid, it can change. Gender is different from your sex, and gender is subjective, meaning, again, we've talked about subjectivity, it's your truth. Whereas the traditional or Christian view of gender says that gender is fixed, it's actually synonymous with sex, and gender is an objective biological reality. The cultural narrative also says that children should be concerned with figuring out their gender, whereas the traditional or Christian view says that children should be encouraged that God made them male or female with a plan and a purpose. And as you can see, even as we compare these, the cultural narrative is a much more scary perspective, whereas the Christian perspective is much more encouraging that God's got a plan for them and that they're not a mistake. The cultural narrative also says that biological sex is assigned at birth, whereas the traditional or Christian view says that biological sex is determined at the moment of conception and it's readily recognized at birth. So it's not that adults are choosing what sex a child has, but rather that is biologically who that person is. The cultural narrative also says that the presence of intersex conditions indicates sex and gender exist on a spectrum, whereas the traditional or Christian view says that the presence of intersex conditions, also called disorders of sexual development, represent rare pathologies rather than a new norm. So we need to be careful too about what children are being taught about biology and intersex and making sure that they're being taught truthfulness. The cultural narrative also says that transgender hormones and surgeries can change your identity as male or female, whereas the Christian perspective says that every single viable cell in the human body is either all male or all female. And hormones and surgeries can't change this reality. Treatments can affect the appearances and even some functionality of certain body parts, but they don't change a person's sex or gender.
So it's not surprising that embracing this ideology, which is not true, also causes significant harm. People who oppose the ideology are being labeled as haters, but is it really loving to accept this? So we want to start by talking about the reality of the harms by listening to a portion of a parent's testimony of her experience. So this is a very common testimony, one that you read or hear similar examples often nowadays. And this is from a very well done blog, Parents with an Inconvenient Truth About Trans, which is linked on the resource guide if you want to read more firsthand testimonies from parents and even kids themselves. So this parent states, a quarter of the girls in my daughter's class identify as transgender, 7 out of 28. She says that this fact begs the question why, and then she hypothesizes. The first issue is with what the school is teaching children. My daughter's trans identity started when the school taught a module on identity during which they told a group of 11-year-olds that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, it means you are transgender. My daughter had just had her first period 2 months prior to this class. Of course, she was feeling uncomfortable in her body. She went home, looked up transgender on TikTok, and that was it. She was now trans. The second issue is a related one, and that is to do with the school's nonstop celebration of LGBTQI+ identities. Transgender heroes, like Jazz Jennings, are worked into any part of the curriculum that they even vaguely fit. This is a school for kids aged 9 to 13. I'm no prude, but I also don't think a constant parade of sexual politics is appropriate for such young children. The third issue is with how the school is approaching the children coming out. Their official policy seems to be just go with whatever the kids say without informing the parents. If a child says they have a new name and pronouns, the school just rolls with it. And they create the scenario where an already distressed child ends up cycling through 4 names within 6 months. None of this would matter if it was just about flags and fun identities, but it's not. For my daughter, the name and pronoun change, which we foolishly went along with on the advice of a therapist, was a tipping point into depression and self-harm. It has made her miserable. When I spoke to the school about the harm they are doing, they would not hear it. They cannot see the transgender issue as anything other than flags and inclusivity and respect. They do not see the dark side that we parents do. We are trying to protect our kids from bone-crushing puberty blockers, from taking cross-sex hormones, from having radical surgery on their developing bodies. Some days it feels like we're holding back a tsunami. I regularly speak to the parents of the other girls. Everyone has had a different response. The one thing that all the parents share is a sense of bafflement. What the heck is going on here? Why is a quarter of the girls in the class identifying as trans? I guess in the 90s, a lot of us were in anorexic friend groups, said one mother. I think the similarities are striking, but there is one major difference. In the 90s, no medical professionals were encouraging these groups of girls in their skewed perceptions of their bodies and their self-harm. No school celebrated anorexia, but this time the doctors and schools are helping the anorexics to diet. So we see from the examples shared earlier and from this testimony that there is often direct instruction in this gender ideology. And unfortunately, there's also immense social pressure, which is being called a social contagion. And this is research-based. One study found that 67% of kids who identified as trans had at least one friend come out as trans at the same time as them. On average, in the friend groups, 3.5 more friends in the peer group would also come out as trans when one kid announced a trans identity. So similarly, the study found that the majority of kids appeared to gain popularity upon announcing their new identity. Most of the children who came out as transgender were part of peer groups that tended to mock people who weren't a part of the LGBTQ community. And then there's also this consistent reinforcement from our culture that this idea or this ideology is true. So from our government, from businesses, workplaces, schools, TV programs that the kids are watching, games, there's just a number of ways this is being reinforced. So there are significant physical, psychological, emotional, social, and spiritual harms. But just in the interest of time, we are just going to touch on a couple of these tonight. So in this image, you can see a young woman who recently had a double mastectomy of healthy breast tissue. What's remarkable to me in this image is how this young lady is covered in self-harm scars, showing a history of being mentally distraught and desperately needing intervention. Yet the surgeon, in her or his affirmation of this child's gender confusion, has just given this child or young adult her largest self-harm scar yet, one which has permanently changed her body for the rest of her life. So not only that, but by going down this route of only affirming these kids in their gender confusion, we're missing out on providing them the real mental health help and intervention that they need. So many trans kids actually do have histories of past trauma and sexual abuse. They are 6 times as likely to have mood or anxiety disorders, and they actually have higher prevalence of every psychiatric diagnosis than the general population. 70% of the kids have social anxiety. Kids with autism are 8 times more likely to present with gender dysphoria. Kids with ADHD, 7 times more likely. So these kids need mental health interventions, not affirmation of their confusion, cross sex hormones, and surgeries. Oftentimes, it appears that this gender dysphoria is more a symptom or sign of underlying mental illness or trauma and something that needs mental health support. So this young lady who was caught up in the trans ideology, Yali Martinez, ended up being taken from her mom's home after a failed suicide attempt, being told that she was better off out of the house away from her mother. The mom was told that she wasn't allowed to talk to her daughter Yali about God, and she begged for a mental health evaluation for her daughter Yali and ended up being denied. And the judge said that the child just needed to be affirmed in her transgender identity. Then this young lady ended up committing suicide and tragically missed out on the help that she needed to get better and get well. So unfortunately, Yali is not alone. One study showed that after trans surgeries, adults were almost 20 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. It didn't help. They didn't get better. Affirmation does not work.
Now, as you remember, we said earlier that evil is perpetuating our brokenness. And we think it's very clear that this gender ideology is doing exactly that. Rather than giving children the much needed mental and emotional support that they need to deal with their gender confusion, they are being pushed to celebrate and embrace that brokenness. And doing so is just leading to more harm.
Yeah. So, on a positive note, doctors are starting to speak out about this issue. And so, this one example, there's several examples. We had to just pick a couple, but this one is Dr. Susan Bradley, who is the head of child and adolescent psychiatry for the University of Toronto for 10 years and is a gender identity disorder expert, even opening a clinic. And she spoke out and said that the current affirmative medical approaches are a matter of grave concern and may reinforce the belief that these kids should proceed to transition as opposed to buying time for them to consider other options. In this amicus brief, Dr. Paul McHugh, who's a Johns Hopkins University Distinguished Service Professor of Psychiatry, he states that the existing studies on the treatment of and outcomes for transgender persons are poor support for gender affirmation or the progression to medication or surgery. Unfortunately, ideology rather than science is driving the support, and dissent is systematically eliminated. Other countries that were ahead of us in embracing this gender ideology are now finding that it causes more harm than good and are shifting their approach. So, the National Academy of Medicine in France, just in February, indicated that they need to increase psychological support and decrease medicalization, that we need to understand the social impact, and that parents need to be vigilant about the addictive character of the excessive consultation of social networks, which is harmful to the psychological development and responsible for a very important part of the growing sense of gender incongruence. Sweden, the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare, also in February, updated their recommendations and said that they now recommend restraint when it comes to hormone treatment because the risks outweigh the benefits at the present. The Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists last year said that the college warns that there is a paucity of quality outcome research to inform treatment decisions. And then just a few weeks ago, the Tavistock Gender Clinic in the UK was closed down because of poor evidence, high risks of harm, and operational failures. Yet, the United States continues to press on with this affirmation and medicalization of our young kids.
All right, so to summarize that last section, children are now being taught a gender confusing ideology through many different outlets within the schools. This ideology is being reaffirmed through our culture and is harming our children by perpetuating and celebrating this confusion. Now, we would like to move on to the second of these two cultural issues that we're digging into, and that is the sexualization of children. So, these days, if you don't believe that children are sexual from birth and have sexual rights, then you are considered a prude. Now, if you remember, we talked about the importance of truth. And those who believe in subjective truth claim that each child should decide for him or herself when they are ready for sex, regardless of their age. Now, also, if you do not accept all forms of sexual behavior as normal behaviors, then you are considered a hater. So, in this last part of our webinar, we will take a look at this cultural ideology of sexuality and identify if this perspective is actually true and loving. And again, we will compare it to a more traditional or Christian perspective. So, there is no question that children should be getting sex education. But the question is really when and what type of information is appropriate for children to be taught at schools. So, the push right now in New York and several other states is to adopt what is called comprehensive sex education. So, comprehensive sex education are sex ed programs from kindergarten to 12th grade which focus on the sexual pleasure and the sexual rights of children. So, our first example here is from the National Sex Ed Standards. And as you can see, the expectation is that children in grades 3 through 5 will be learning about masturbation in a classroom setting. And children in grades 6 through 8 are expected to understand different types of sexual activities like vaginal, oral, and anal sex, along with the use of sex toys to engage in some of these activities. So, our question here is why do children as young as 8 years old need classroom instruction on masturbation? And why do children as young as 11 need classroom instruction about anal and oral sex and sex toys? Now, if we're honest, I think we have to admit that they don't need this type of instruction, especially at those ages, and that teaching children these form of sexual behaviors is just meant to normalize them.
Right. And this is also entering all classrooms, just like it did with the gender issue. And so this writing prompt book was used in an Ohio English class, and it had kids write about a sex scene you wouldn't want your mom to read. And then another example was describe a professor coming on to one of his students, and the examples go on from there. There are also numerous books, and many parents are now fighting this book issue specifically. And that's what we often see in the news are the parents speaking out about what's in their children's libraries, which is a very important thing that they're doing. So this example that we have on the screen is sex is a funny word, and it's one of the worst examples that I've seen yet. But the New York Times just recently touted it as a book that every family in America should read. And it was also recently listed as a book that every teacher should have in their classroom to promote diversity. These books also enter libraries because activist organizations actually donate large quantities of books to schools to diversify their libraries and make them more LGBT focused. So, this book specifically has many issues. First, it turns sex into a cartoon to make it light, easy, and funny for young kids, blurring the line that this is something serious that could also be dangerous. Again, this is for young children. It shows cartoons of a young child masturbating and having an orgasm. It compares adults and kids' butts and encourages them to touch their anus. It avoids the word private and calls them middle parts, removing the boundary that they should be private and essentially equating someone's genitals with the same privacy needed of a belly button and so forth. So, a lot of concerns with this book and with many of the books that our children are having access to at school.
So, children are also being sexualized through role playing. Now, children are expected to role play with their peers the use of contraception, communicating sexual desires, and giving and getting consent. Children are also expected and encouraged to interact with adults when accessing contraception and information, and they are encouraged to get counsel from so called trusted adults that are not their parents.
Right. And another example is through videos. So the video on the left is an example from the Amaze series of videos, which many sex ed lessons use, or actually they refer students to watch on their own, which is also terrible. I blocked out parts of the image because of how inappropriate it is. This video, while the main point is that porn shouldn't be our sex ed, thinks that by making a cartoon out of it, it somehow isn't sexualizing children. It also is that the only problem with pornography is that it sometimes exaggerates things or misses out on certain safety issues. But we know that there are so many more harms associated with pornography. Many of the sex ed advocates are pro pornography, and even one of the lessons in a sex ed curriculum that we reviewed had high schoolers looking at covers of pornographic magazines to discuss how sex is used to sell, but making them actually look at pornography to do the assignment. The second video on the screen was shown to kids in schools as a Trans Day of Awareness event, but starts off by bringing up highly sexualized questions like how does a trans person have sex and things like that. Definitely inappropriate and sexualizing our kids and normalizing this level of conversation in the classroom setting.
Children are also being encouraged to attend family drag shows where they will be exposed to sexual dancing, encouraged to give money to performers, and even encouraged to perform themselves. Now, why are drag queens seeking an audience with with children? And again, we believe that this is to normalize these behaviors. I recently watched an interview with a drag queen who had said that if it wasn't for the fans, drag performers would just be weird people who danced in front of their mirrors at like 2 a.m. And I think that they admitted a lot more than they realized when they had said that.
So, a question that we have is why are schools training children to access condoms, hormones, birth control, and sexual information without a parent's knowledge or consent? So, this video, for example, teaches kids how to ask questions to make sure their parents will not find out what they're doing when accessing sexual health services. So, it asks, can I get services here without my parents' permission? Will my parents be told about my visit? Will my parents be allowed to see my records? How will you contact me if you need to? Will my parents see the bill if there is one? So it's again encouraging children to become sexual and engage in sexual activity and then access support and health services without their parents ever knowing. And finally, this is our last example here. We need to ask, why is Planned Parenthood, who performs abortions on 96.9% of their pregnant clients, also the #1 sex educator in America? Well, this one does have an answer. So the former medical director of Planned Parenthood is quoted saying the only avenue that the International Planned Parenthood Federation and its allies could travel to win the battle for abortion on demand is through sex education. So this was a goal of sex education from the beginning.
Okay, so now that we have reviewed some examples of how children as young as 5 or 6 are being sexualized, again, let's try to outline the difference between what the culture is teaching about sex and sexuality and the traditional or Christian view of sex and sexuality. And again, just remember that we do have this chart on our parent resource guide. Okay, so first of all, the cultural narrative says that children are sexual from birth and that children have sexual rights. And this is at the very foundation of most of the lessons that we're seeing being taught to our kids today. Whereas the traditional or the Christian view says that a child's sexuality develops during adolescence, and that's why they have sex education courses, is to understand the changes that are happening in their body and so forth. And because of that, children should be protected from harm. The cultural narrative also says that children should be taught any and all sexual information at early ages. Whereas the traditional or Christian view says that childhood innocence should be protected, kids should be taught age appropriate information. The cultural narrative also says that sex is positive. Sex is positive at any age. Any sexual activity is positive, and any sexual activity with any gender is positive as well. Whereas the traditional view says that sexual activities are best within the context of adult, committed relationships. And as Christians, we would say specifically marriage, and that sexual activities at a young age causes harm. Now, the cultural narrative also says that instruction should focus on diversity and teaching children how to give consent. Whereas the traditional view says that instruction should focus on biology and teaching children how to protect themselves and resist pressure. And I'll just mention here that I did talk to a mother at a local school district near me, and she said it is awful hearing stories from the young girls there who feel pressured to engage in sexual activities with the boys, and that pressure is enormous on the girls within those school districts. So, the cultural narrative also says that schools are the instructional authority for children, whereas the traditional or Christian view says that parents are primarily responsible for the instruction and protection of their children. And finally, the cultural narrative says that all forms of sex and pleasure should be celebrated and not limited. Whereas the traditional or Christian view says that we need to respect our sexuality by honoring the God given boundaries that He's given us. Because to be honest, He has given us boundaries so that we can be healthy and others can be healthy as well.
So we just want to introduce here the reality of the harms at the sexual level as well. And so there are many physical, psychological, emotional, social, and spiritual harms here. And we have reviewed those Bridget's reviewed them with Dr. John Sanford in the book, The Sexual Holocaust. And so we do recommend that you read this book. It is available for purchase on the website, or you can download a free PDF version to review this, but just for the purposes of this presentation today, we want to touch on a couple of those so we can understand how this is not loving to our children to enforce this ideology on them. So one of the harms that we want to mention is that the comprehensive sex ed programs that are being pushed in schools are actually causing more harm than good. So the largest research study showed that out of 103 international school-based comprehensive sex ed programs, only 6 of them found any evidence of effectiveness over the year following the program. 16 of the studies included in this meta-analysis found instances of harmful effects, such as the ones you see on the screen. So decreased condom use, increased rates of sexual activity, increased number of partners, increased rates of oral sex, forced sex, STDs, and teenage pregnancies. And you can see from those numbers that most of the studies showed no effect at all. Yet we saw through the examples that these programs are quite inappropriate for our kids. So why are they being pushed into our schools if they're not effective at helping children?
Yeah. Now, some people will argue that, this stuff isn't sexualizing our kids because, again, the prevailing cultural belief is that children are sexual from birth. However, all of the examples that we shared tonight are desensitizing our kids to a variety of highly sexual content. And, you know, even sexual interactions with adults and their peers. And this is grooming them to be comfortable with sexual interactions with adults, which puts them at a much higher risk of sexual abuse. Now, 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys will be sexually abused by the time that they're 18 years old. And, that was even a statistic from a few years ago. So child abuse is only going to become more and more prevalent as schools encourage children to role play sexual scenarios and talk to adults about sexual issues.
And we need to remember too that Planned Parenthood is performing abortions on 96.9% of their pregnant clients, and they have reached over 1.1 to 1.2 million American kids through their sex ed programs every year, and over 2.5 million kids through their digital education sessions and videos. So it follows then that the 50 million abortions globally represent a higher death toll than the top 10 leading causes of death combined. And abortions accounted for just over 42% of all human deaths in 2021.
Wow. So, as we've seen through some of our examples, books and videos are trying to teach children that varying sexual behaviors are fun and they're normal. However, the promotional of casual sexual activity actually causes children emotional and social harm because they will struggle to form healthy, committed relationships when they're older. Now, studies have showed an increase in depression and suicide for those who engage in casual sexual activities compared to those who have more committed relationships. Sexual intimacy should be put in a context where it is sacred, where it's respected, and where it's protected. And, as Christians, we would say that that marriage relationship is the healthiest context for sexual intimacy. Now, besides being taught that sexual activities are fun and casual, children are also being taught that all forms of sexual behavior are normal and are just different forms of love. But we need to understand that what is really happening is that our culture is confusing love and lust. So, by calling all sexual desires love, the cultural narrative is teaching our children that they have a license or a right to do whatever they want. But it should be clear to all of us that giving license for individuals to do whatever they want is extremely harmful. Instead of teaching children how to love one another with real, true, unconditional love, our culture is promoting and celebrating harmful sexual practices. So to reiterate what we said earlier, this is what we mean by evil.
So we've just been through a lot of information and we saw how our understanding of love and truth are being twisted to allow for these ideologies. We saw how kids are being indoctrinated with a false gender ideology that causes irreversible harms. And we saw how kids are being sexualized in schools. And I hope that it's clear that at the root of all of this, there seems to be a spiritual battle. And when we see it this way, it does change our perspective. When we see it as an issue of good versus evil, we're motivated to stand up for the truth and protect kids from evil by instructing them in the truth and by standing against letting these ideologies creep in. So I'm not saying that if your child is caught up in the trans ideology, that they themselves are evil and that we need to battle them, but rather that we need to try to protect them from this evil. So, for some self disclosure that hopefully helps illuminate what I'm trying to say. So, as a school counselor, I don't think I recognized how deep this spiritual battle was. I certainly was speaking to others about what was going on and what I was seeing, and I was asking my elders about how to handle these issues. But I did just casually affirm children in their gender identity by using the preferred pronouns that they gave to me. And that was just expected. Everyone else did it. And it was just the norm. And I didn't stand up against that. I didn't say, no, I'm not going to use these preferred pronouns or find a way around that. I just went along with that portion of it. And I now recognize that just going along with the culture is a huge problem. And I now respond to these issues differently in my current workplaces. And so I just wanted to bring that up just to mention that I know it's easier just to go along with these things sometimes because you're not raising any red flags, you can keep your job and not have any conflicts. I know a lot of people just don't like any sort of conflict and certainly it would create some to go against this narrative in the workplace or in our personal lives. But we need to recognize that this is a spiritual battle and that we need to be motivated to stand on the side of truth and the side of reality and the side of true love, not what this culture is promoting, because what this culture is promoting is evil. Okay, so during the live webinar, we did answer live questions that folks were able to text into us. And we did just want to bring one of those questions back into this re-recording that we're doing. And that was about just the issue of suicide among transgender identified youth. And the person just asked that we expand upon that a little bit. So we're going to do that now. Bridget, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think I just want to, remind us that the question here is this issue of, you know, affirming a child in their transgender, is that loving or is that true? And so, if you think about even just the loving part of it, from the statistics that Carrie shared, I think it should be obvious that it's not loving. For example, Carrie had pointed out that transgendered adults, after they've had the sex reassignment surgeries, they're 20 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. And so if that's true, then it's really not loving to encourage these children who really are struggling to go forward with all of these options and changing and harming their bodies. And so just to start off with that, I think hopefully we've made it clear tonight that it really isn't loving and that there is so much harm associated with this.
Yeah, that's right. And I just want to bring up too that not affirming a child in their gender confusion actually is better for them. And that actually every study on the topic has shown that not affirming a child with gender dysphoria in their gender confusion, but rather loving them, providing any needed mental health support, and so on, that those kids, most of them embrace their biological sex by adulthood. And so that gender dysphoria, it goes away or it changes and they fully embrace who they are and their biological sex. So if that's the case and not affirming is causing improvement, but affirming is leading to increased medicalization, increased surgeries, and then that is leading to a 20 times higher suicide rate after all of that, then we're not helping. And so this idea that schools certainly and definitely doctors and others are saying this narrative, well, if you don't affirm, then a child's going to commit suicide. And there's this narrative that's being promoted, well, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? And that's not true, and it's extraordinarily manipulative. And it's just not an okay narrative for us to be promoting for a number of reasons. So one that we already mentioned, when you don't affirm, the kid ends up embracing their sex. When you don't, they end up being pushed, or when you do affirm them, they end up being pushed into medicalization and so forth. Another is that this gender dysphoria, like we mentioned, is often a symptom of underlying mental illness or past trauma or abuse. So affirming that is just affirming this confusion and this delusion that that is the correct problem to be addressing, and we're ignoring the real problems and letting them just sit there and get worse, and we're not addressing it. And so there's certainly a lack of needed mental health care for this population. um, a lot of the mental health support is just about, let's get everyone in your life to affirm you and affirm, yes, this is your true gender identity, and let's put you in a culture where you're going to be affirmed and all of that, and that's not helping the child. And then the final point on this suicide issue that I want to mention is that suicide itself is known to be a social contagion. And so I know when I was working at the school, we were a part of a team where if there was a suicide in any given school in our area, we would help provide some crisis support for the other schools. So, like if they needed additional counselors, like we could come in and be additional counselors in their school to help the children, or really any type of crisis if there was any major crisis in that school. And so we were taught through that team that if a child does die by suicide, you are not to memorialize that in any way as a school district. Now, individual groups of kids could, they could get together and wear a certain color that was that child's favorite color or something. But as a school district, you weren't allowed to have some sort of memorial or assembly or anything like that, because it raises that person up and it almost makes the suicide seem like a noble thing, and it brings the child a lot of desired and needed attention. And what they found was when that happened, kids were more likely to commit suicide after that. And they found the same with the recent TV show 13 Reasons Why, and that glamorized suicide, and the rates of suicide went up after that among the teen population. And so we know that promoting this narrative that, well, trans children who are not affirmed will commit suicide, that's going to be dangerous. That itself, promoting that narrative, is going to possibly cause higher rates of suicides because they're being taught that that's okay. that if you're not affirmed, it's okay to consider suicide. Suicide is never a proper or healthy coping mechanism. And so, certainly, there's a lot of problems with that narrative, and it's not true, it's not helpful, and it's causing more harm. So, hopefully, that answers that question a little bit more thoroughly.
All right, and we just want to encourage you guys to also check out part 2 of our webinar series that we did with Dr. Brewer. And before we close, I just want to just end in prayer and thank you guys so much for joining us. Lord, we thank you so much for all that you've done for us. We thank you so much for giving us wisdom. We just ask, Lord, that you please be with the parents and the guardians and the aunts and the uncles and the teachers and everybody, Lord, who has young children in their lives, Lord, or those who are dealing with these transgender issues, or even with the sexualization of children, Lord. We just pray that you give us all wisdom, help us to lead and guide the children in our lives, Lord, with truth and with love, Father. I just pray that the work that we do is encouraging to others and that it helps build us up and really support us and helps us to guide to a healthy lifestyle, Lord. And we thank you for all that you've done for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.